Okay, here we are back for the session on shadow and ego work in relationship. So we're going to talk a little bit about shadow work, which is kind of our forte. When Ben and I talked to you in the intro about starting out in this work together, a lot of the stuff that we did was in shadow work chambers, which was a group of like 30 people. We would meet every single week for 3 hours, and we would actively do shadow work processes and exercises together. And it was sort of like purifying. It was like tearing down the layers and the walls of protection. But what we want to explain to you is how the ego and the shadow works and how it shows up in a relationship. So first, what is shadow work?
Okay, here's how I explain shadow work. And this is a Jungian concept. Carl Jung was originally worked with Freud, the first most famous psychologist. And the way that he explains shadow is that as we're growing up, there become parts of you, certain ways of expressing yourself that you're told are not okay by your society, by your parents, by your experiences. You know, you do something, you behave a certain way, and then you get feedback from the world that that's not a safe way to be. And so you decide to push that part of yourself down. It's not appropriate anymore, and I'm going to just hide it over here, and we reject that part of yourself. And in its place, you put up a persona that is essentially a mask, right? If you've ever heard people talk about like the masks that they wear, well, whatever's behind the mask tends to be a part of your shadow. It's just unseen. And so shadow work is this process of reclaiming parts of yourself that you have hidden. And so some really common things that are hidden are certain parts of your sex life or your sexual desires. Anger tends to be really inappropriate in most societies, and anger often is seen as dangerous and not okay. And so we all have our own sort of ways of suppressing and pushing away anger. And for a lot of people, vulnerability and just showing your emotions is not okay, not safe, not appropriate. And so we hide that stuff. And instead, we put a persona of being okay all the time, being unfazed by anything in the world. No, I'm not feeling any emotions. And so shadow work is learning to re-engage those emotions, those ways of being, and expose them. This is why a lot of people don't do shadow work in these, I love how you said chambers. It's like, sounds like a dungeon, but it is kind of confronting. I was always shaking going into those groups, because what we would do is stand in front of the other people and expose those vulnerable parts of ourselves that we had hidden away for so long. But we're not asking you guys to do that, but we are asking you to engage that process of finding what parts of you have you hidden from yourself and from your partner that aren't okay. Because as uncomfortable as it is, the more you lean into that kind of work and the more you lean into it together, first of all, you build that bond together, you build a level of trust, and you break through the parts, you break through these walls that were keeping you from yourself. And as you do that, you can move closer to your partner. And what you said about ego, the reason why we said ego work as well, is that the ego is wrapped up in this. So you can think of your ego as the part of you that is protecting you in the world. The ego says the world is unsafe. The elements are out to get you. There's goblins and ghouls and monsters out there, and you have to protect yourself. The world is not a safe place, and you need a fortress. You need to build a fortress around yourself. And the ego is a useful thing in nature. It's a useful thing to, in a sense, maintain your sovereignty and get things done in the world. But it also has an agenda to insulate you from vulnerability. And then we enter into relationship with someone and we want to move close to them, and then they start to see our most vulnerable sides, and the ego gets activated and wants to protect us from the other person. And so there's a power struggle. even internally, right? Like, I want to be close to you, but I also don't want you to like see certain parts of me. And so we need to, in a sense, do work to deflate our egos so that we can be closer to each other.
Another way that I like to explain it is that we have an adaptive self and an authentic self. When we are experiencing some sort of trauma, or if we are constantly invalidated, or if love was conditional when we were developing, then we might have adapted in order to win love or approval, or just to survive and stay safe. So if I come into my relationship with that conditioning, then I might have an inherent belief that certain emotions or certain ways of being should be kept hidden from my partner. Otherwise, he won't love me anymore, right? The other thing about shadow work that's interesting is that some of the ways that the shadow takes over in relationship is that if I don't have a healthy relationship with my anger, if I have an inherent belief that my anger is bad or wrong, what I might end up coming up against is that whenever I do experience anger, I either turn it down completely and turn it inwards on myself, which becomes shame, or what will happen is I will completely deny that I have any anger until it gets to be so uncomfortable that I explode, and then I explode on my partner. That's because I wasn't giving any space for anger to exist at all. I wasn't giving it a healthy seat at the table. So I wasn't able to have an adult, mature relationship with my anger and come to my partner maturely and express my anger or my boundary, or say, hey, this thing really didn't feel good for me. Here's what I need in order to feel safe in this relationship. Instead, my child self might come out and I might have a tantrum, or I might act out. And this is really where we see a lot of couples acting out in ways that hurt their partner, they hurt their partner's feelings, or they completely sabotage the relationship. And this is the shadow in action. It's that part of us that is hurt, but instead of showing it, or instead of stepping in with our more mature adult self, we let the ego run the show and kind of step in to defend us. And when we let that happen, our coping mechanisms and our defenses are often not the healthiest, right? So when we're looking at how does our shadow self show up in relationship, we're looking at, okay, so if I'm not going to show my vulnerability, or I'm not going to show my tenderness, how am I going to show up? So when we got married, we actually wrote shadow vows to each other. We also wrote what we called sacred vows, which are, the promise that we want to make to each other for how we want to work towards showing up every day. But the shadow vows were really us claiming and owning how we're going to show up on our bad days, and saying, hey, when you enter into a relationship with me, you need to know that I'm accountable for how I show up on my worst days. I'm aware of it. I'm working on it, and it's present in this relationship, right? So one of my shadow vows to you was that I vowed to project my unavailable father onto you, right? Mm-hmm. And another vow that I think that I made, a shadow vow, was that I was going to criticize you for not holding space for me, and those are true things. Like, that's when I'm in my defenses, I'm not in my heart. That's kind of how I show up. I think one of yours was about invalidating my feelings.
Psychoanalyzing you instead.
Yeah. And so, you can see how we can do this really playfully. We laugh about it now, right? It takes a while to get there. And one caveat is that it's never up to you to call out your partner's shadow. You call out your own shadow. Your partner can do that work for themselves. It's not a fun game when you start picking each other apart.
Yeah, go ahead.
But when I'm sharing with my partner what my shadow is and what my defenses are, it's like a full taking responsibility, and it becomes playful, and it also leaves less room for that to come in and hijack the experience.
There's one other piece that I want to make sure people understand here, because you were talking about sort of the two ways when you're rejecting your own anger, the two ways that it can go internally, where it's like stuffed or it explodes, right? there's one other thing that's quite interesting, and it's because the mind is so smart and so cunning, and that is that if I reject anger altogether and it's not okay, and I tell myself, like if someone says like, hey, are you an angry person? I say, no, I haven't been angry in years, right? Clearly I'm very disconnected from my anger. It's just not okay, it's not appropriate. And so what can happen is if Shalina experiences anger, it might not even be about me. She might just be in the house angry. I get triggered and I want her to stop with her anger. Like, your anger is not okay. You need to take that anger somewhere else. And I get really uncomfortable with it. Maybe she's just frustrated that she can't get the damn jar open, whatever it is. So what I'm doing is basically I'm projecting in a way, right? Like, her anger is inflaming my internal discomfort with anger, and then it all becomes about her being a problem. Meanwhile, what's really going on is I have no connection to my anger. I'm not able to hold space for it because I don't have room for it in me. It's been so rejected. And so it's really important for people to ask themselves these questions about different parts of the self through this course, because what we need to create here is an environment where all things are allowed and where we can sort of confront that stuff.
Yeah.
So it's very important to notice that the mind will often have an issue with someone else's emotion, and you need to look at what that is inside yourself that isn't okay with that.
Yeah, I like that example, and it reminds me of some of the Imago couples work that I've done, where they talk about how your partner's greatest need will often be the thing that's hardest for you to give, because typically what happens in a relationship when our partner is asking us for something, it's usually because they're calling for the lost part of ourselves. So if I want to experience something from my partner, or if I have a need that I want my partner to meet, it's often related to a part of them that they have let go dormant, or a part of them that they've rejected or suppressed or denied. So if you want to think about it this way, sometimes what we're doing when we're asking each other for something is we're trying to wake up little parts of each other, right? In a really beautiful way, where, you know, maybe I want to evoke my partner's emotional side, and so I'm bringing him a lot of emotion and I want him to meet me there, not because that's what I need specifically, even though that's what my mind will tell me, but also because there's a part of me that senses that he hasn't fully let himself experience that.
Yeah.
You know, and so I'm trying to wake that up. So if we can see these requests from our partner as an invitation to, you know, dance in a part of ourselves that maybe we haven't let shine in a while, then that's where shadow work can be really fun and really liberating, because we can kind of step into different emotions, different characters, different parts of ourselves that maybe we tucked away. And we can try that on. And that's where we become more integrated. It's really about integration and self-acceptance. So when we notice something in ourselves that we've denied or suppressed, if we give it space to exist, what happens is that it no longer either completely dominates our experience because it's fighting for attention, or we feel like we have more energy in our lives because we trust and know all of ourselves, and we can bring that to our partner, and we also know that we'll be received, right? So as long as we're rejecting each other, or we're hiding parts of ourselves, or we're telling each other that certain things are not okay, it's not really a safe container to show up fully and be fully expressed. And that's where resentment builds. And so doing this work can be really liberating, and even bring back sexual chemistry and passion that maybe has been blocked by a belief that, you know, some of you is not acceptable.
Okay, let's talk about some examples of how the shadow presents in relationship.
So a few ways that the shadow might show up. And again, we're going to talk about the adaptive self here, okay? So if I learned that my vulnerability wasn't safe, or if I was told that, you know, who I am is too sensitive, or is not enough, or if I was picked on a lot, or if I was abused, or if I was abandoned, which, you know, personally, that's my story. I was abandoned as a child, and I grew up in foster homes. So for me, my adaptive self was really tough. and really aggressive and even sometimes a little mean. And underneath it, I was this really, really sensitive, really tender, very small framed girl. I'm a very small framed woman. So I'm actually very tiny, but I have a really strong personality, and that's something that I had to learn to work with, because my adaptive self told me that showing my vulnerability was weak and that it wasn't safe, that if I showed my partner my tenderness, or if I let him in when I was upset, that he might try to control me, or he might try to abuse me, or that he might try to take me over, or that I wouldn't be seen, or that I would disappear. So my shadow self is the one that defends. It's the one that criticizes. It's the one that says, go away, when I actually really just want to hug. Mm-hmm. It's the one that says, I'm out of here, and takes off and tries to end the relationship. And so there's blaming, there's criticizing, there's attacking, there's defending. But really, whatever your defense mechanism is, whatever your coping mechanism is, that's your shadow, but it's also your adaptive self. So we want to look at all of this with a really tender frame. So when we're talking about the shadow or the ego or the adaptive self, there's no room for guilt or shame or blame here. Mm-hmm. Really, whatever you find, you need to trust that that is how you had to adapt and show up in order to survive and be safe. Yeah. And I think it's brilliant that we do that. And so really just being gentle with yourself along the way, whatever you find or whatever you see in your partner, really loving that part too, and knowing that, wow, isn't it amazing that I learned how to survive all of that, or that you learned how to survive your childhood by showing up the way that you did. And now we're in a new space, in a new environment. Mm-hmm. This is a different relationship, one where we're healing together. So I'm learning how to tear down my own walls slowly and show my vulnerability. And I think, it's taken us years to really get there.
Yeah, when you show me even just a little crack, I'm receptive to it, and I start to open up. And maybe sometimes it doesn't feel that way, like you've shown me some vulnerability and it's like he's not taking the cue, but the truth is, the more you show me, the more I soften, because mm-hmm. my love for you pours through when I mm-hmm. see how wounded you are. Mm-hmm. And initially it can come off as sort of guarded and stabby, and my walls go up, mm-hmm. right? And so we were talking about the adaptive self. My adaptive self stonewalls and pulls away. Mm-hmm. And I go logical, I work with the mind, and I stay disconnected, and Shalina's bringing something to me, and I'm rationalizing, defending, saying that it's not a big deal and that she's just freaking out, and staying very detached from the thing. Mm-hmm. Where maybe in the background I'm actually feeling a lot of things. I'm feeling criticized, I'm feeling sensitive, I'm feeling like I'm blowing it as a partner. That's a very common one, where I feel like whatever she's bringing, it represents some failure of me as a man. And meanwhile, I'm not sharing any of that stuff with her. And so the way that I can break through that is by showing some level of vulnerability, showing that I feel like what you're saying is that I'm a screw up, I'm a failure as a person, a failure as a husband and as a partner, and then she responds to that. So the way that we've navigated a lot of conflict is via these little tiny chinks in the armor, cracks in the armor. Right. Just to refer to one of the principles, principle number 7 reads, resentment grows from holding back our truth. Passion grows from honesty. And so that's really important in this process of learning about shadow work and working through the ego. Is like, we want to go past a surface level of honesty. You want to go deeper than you've normally gone, mm-hmm. and dig in, and that brings you closer. And
doing it with grace, right? So there's honesty that is cutting, and then there's honesty that is gentle and truthful. And I think it's really important that we make that distinction. You don't need to throw your truth at your partner in an aggressive way, and you don't need to share every thought that you have or every criticism or judgment that you have with your partner. In fact, not really conducive at all. What we mean by honesty is personal honesty, accountability for your mind and for your emotions, what's really true for you or what this represents. So when Ben said that when I show him my vulnerability and he can see that wounded part, what I'm doing is that I'm exposing that childhood wound to him in that moment. I'm allowing him to see that part of me that is being called forth for healing in that moment. And so if we look at our partnerships as opportunities for healing and growth, and when we see these moments of trigger or upset, or when we feel hurt as an opportunity to go deeper into that and actually heal it with our partner, then that's where the magic happens. So by me, taking a risk and showing him my vulnerability, then he has this sacred responsibility to hold that in a tender way. Otherwise, I might become even more wounded and I might retreat and learn that it's not safe, right? And that's how we end up in relationships where we are either not being total, we're not bringing our truth, or we just shut down altogether. And so we both have a sacred responsibility to hold each other's wounds with tenderness, with love, with care. It's not a responsibility to heal each other's wounds per se. We're all doing that work for ourselves, but it is our responsibility to serve as a healing partner. And as we said before, to serve as an ally in the healing. And so we can only do that when we can see beyond that defense, beyond that shadow, into the heart of what is really happening for you.
Okay. That's it for the intro on shadow and ego work in relationship. We're going to move on to the exercises, so we'll see you there.
In conflict, my tendency is to defend or shut down.
Mm-hmm. Okay, if I'm hearing that correctly, when we're in conflict, your tendency is to defend or shut down. Did I get that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I use the coping mechanism to defend or shut down to protect myself from feeling rejected or embarrassed.
Mm-hmm. So if I'm hearing that right, you use the coping mechanism of defending or shutting down to protect yourself against feeling embarrassed and hurt?
Rejected.
Okay, let me do that again. If I'm hearing that correctly, you use the coping mechanism of defending or shutting down to protect yourself against feeling embarrassed or rejected. Did I get that?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I'm afraid to be vulnerable because when I was growing up, it wasn't safe to show my emotions.
Mm-hmm. You're afraid to be vulnerable because when you were growing up, it wasn't safe to feel your emotions. Did I get that?
Yes. Mm-hmm. I am willing to take a risk and be vulnerable with you.
I want to hold space for your vulnerability.
Thank you for seeing me.
Thank you for letting me see you. I'd like to share with you. Are you available?
Yes.
Okay. When we're in conflict, my tendency is to withdraw and shut down emotionally.
So what I'm hearing is that when we're in conflict, your tendency is to withdraw and shut down emotionally. Did I get that?
Yes. I use that coping mechanism of withdrawing or shutting down emotionally to protect myself from feeling, let's say, attacked and hurt.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that you use that coping mechanism of shutting down and withdrawing emotionally to protect yourself against feeling attacked and hurt. Did I get that?
Yes. I'm afraid to be vulnerable because I don't want to get my feelings hurt and I feel like I have to be strong all the time.
So So what I'm hearing you say is that you're afraid to be vulnerable because you don't want to get your feelings hurt and you feel like you have to be strong all the time. Did I get that?
Yeah. I am willing to take a risk and be vulnerable with you.
I want to hold space for your vulnerability.
Thank you for seeing me.
Thank you for letting me see you.